So, a very good evening to all of you present here. Today is the second day of our week-long session of Drishtikon, where we are discussing disability and Hindi cinema. And today we have the lecture given to you by Mansi Grover. She is a PhD research scholar at the Jamia Millia Islamia, and she would be discussing some of the readings that have been mentioned in the Google Drive shared with all of you. So as a part of the Center for Disability Research and Training by the Kirori Mal College, we present to you the second lecture. Over to you, Mansi.
Thank you so much, Priyam. Anu, just let me know in case I'm going too fast. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So before I go on to talking about things that were mentioned in my schedule, I was just curious to know why are we all here for this workshop, and what do we think about why we wanted to be a part of this workshop, and what made us curious that we should come and join a 6-day workshop, something on disability and how cinema is representing it. It's a 6-day thing, it's a longish thing. So I just wish to know from any one of you, what is your what brought you here? Anyone?
Good evening. I'm Amrita.
Hi, Amrita.
And hi. Yes. So I had taken up a course on disability studies where we looked at the representation of disability in literature. And I really wanted to know how disability is represented in cinema. Especially, I got interested into all these superhero movies where disability becomes sort of like the origin story. And I wanted to know how, how you kind of learn about it or how you study it, and whether this is true for Hindi cinema also and things like that. So that's what got me interested into this workshop.
All right. And what are the various fields of, the people that we have here? Are we from diverse fields or are we from academia? Anyone? So that I also get a hang of it, that who I am addressing to.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Anjana.
Okay. Hi, Anjana.
Hi, ma'am. I'm a research scholar in IIT Roorkee, and I am working on repressed sexuality of people with disabilities in Indian cinema. I'm doing my first year right now, and I'm focusing on how the sexuality of the people with disabilities is addressed in cinema, and how the kind of normal imagination is acting upon defining the sexuality of people with disabilities.
All right. That's a lot for a first year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just wanted to know that, when we are sitting here learning about disability, are we also looking at the fundamentals of who we are? Disability studies is not just a study about disability. It is also a study about who we are. When Leonard Davis talks about how disability has been excluded from the triad of gender, race, and class, he talks about why it is so important to talk about disability, because disability is something that is going to affect each one of us someday or the other, right? When we talk about ability, who do we think we are talking about when we talk about able body? Anyone?
Again, ma'am, I think I have read in some of the, I don't remember exactly who said this, the ability is supposed to be, or ability is defined as some kind of an expectation that is said to be performed at one particular moment or one space or an action that is something which is expected from the people, and thereby we define the ability, and those who like make it up will become abled, and those who fail to do so are defined as disabled. I think I have read this from I think in disability studies reader itself, or from Tom Shakespeare. I'm not remembering it right.
A second, let's forget about Tom Shakespeare.
Ha.
Let's talk about things around us.
In my opinion, I think the ableist cultures sets some of the standards or the kind of competitiveness, and so that the idea of very accessibility and everything is being defined by them. The standards are being set up, so it is something which nurtures again and again the ableist society, and thereby stereotyping the people belonging to disabled community.
All right, Anjana, thank you so much for your answer. And you have rightly pointed out, and the key words that you used, standard, the ideal. I think standard is something that we need to look at. How is this standard created? How is a norm created? And this is what I mean to say when I'm asking you to go back to the fundamentals of who we are. How do we define the norm? How do we define the ideal? How do we define the standard? And when I talk about who is creating a representation and who are those people involved in creating that piece of representation, when we talk about films, who are we talking about? Who are the people who are sitting behind the cameras and creating something for an audience? And what are they assuming the audience to be? So everything that we are talking about is based on assumptions. Assumption that the viewer is able, assumption that I am able, assumption that the majority is able. So with this workshop, my particular aim would be to look at what we are. Whether are we actually able? So let us problematize this term, something that we use in day-to-day language, something as we would call it as normal. Who is normal? Who is defining this norm? Let us problematize this term using cinema. How cinema is also a tool, which is also, it's like, it's also based on a structure which the society is creating, and how it is passed on to the viewers. So it is also based on a structure which is ableist, which is again, created on an assumption. That is the majoritarian assumption. So let us try to problematize these terms. And before I go on to do that, let me first share my PPT here. How do I switch on the slideshow?
From beginning out there itself.
Yeah, sorry. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to read the basics of disability studies through Hindi cinema. When we talk about disability studies, let's take a step back and talk about ability first. Disability and ability, these are very These are relational concepts. When we talk about somebody being normal, somebody being able, that very moment we create a deviance. That very moment we create a deviant figure, something like who is a disabled. So normal and disabled would go hand in hand. Ability and disability would go hand in hand. When we are creating these binaries, we need to look at the able-bodied figure first. Let's not look at the disabled first. Let us look at the abled figure first. All right. Before doing that, let me just go back and give you a short recap of what Priyam addressed yesterday. She talked about the root causes of discriminatory attitudes towards people with disabilities, and she talked about different models of disability that we see around us in India, namely charity model, religious model, rehabilitative model, and medical model. Then she moved on to talk about narrative processes and how these films use narrative processes as a way of representing disability as different kind of tropes and in other ways. And actors, how they take up these roles and call these roles as challenging, and which would, which are also award-winning roles for them. Then there are feel-good films with happy endings, which I would also go on to discuss about that. Then she also talked about films with rare disabilities, disabilities like progeria and something like dyslexia, which Tare Zameen Par popularized. Before that, nobody knew about it, and something like progeria, and how before Pa nobody had a clue about progeria. So how these films are also, trying to bring forth this idea of rare disabilities, and it has its own commercials related to it. And how these films also talk about disability getting rectified, and how characters are overcompensating for their disability to match the norm. Now, most of the films that we'll talk about would, either they would be rectifying the disability towards the end, or they would show characters overcompensating for their disability. So it's usually this binary of either cure or something like an inspiration porn, right? So we'll deal with that in a while. And before we go on to talk about the films, let us first look at the term norm. And norm is something that I feel we need to go to, at the basics of it, how we construct bodies, how we construct the other, and how we construct and how we see who is a deviant figure, somebody who is not conforming to the norm, somebody who is not the standard, somebody who is not regular, somebody who is not usual, is generally seen as a deviant figure. And throughout history, and Western scholars also talk about it, how throughout history, somebody who is a deviant figure, somebody who is seen as not conforming to the expectations of the society, is seen as, is to be kept in an asylum, is to be kept hidden. There is a shame, there is a guilt attached to that person. And there are loads of stereotypes. There is a load of stereotypes that we create around that person. And that person is reduced to those particular stereotypes, to those attributes. And that creates a stigma. So the terms like stigma, norm, normative, stigmatized, you would come across these terms when you start your journey into disability studies. So it's very important to understand these terms from their basics itself. Now, when we talk about an ideal body, what is this ideal body? Can we actually attain it? This idea of perfect body, this idea of a body, and I have borrowed a term diaphanous body. What is a diaphanous body? It's a very interesting term. Diaphanous is something which is transparent. Transparent, which doesn't feel anything. Transparent, which is clear, which has a lot of clarity. And something which is unattainable in human capacity. So these are bodies that you would usually associate with gods. Therefore, I have used the term here mythopoetic bodies. So this is something that is unattainable. So what is attainable then? How do you see the ideal in terms of which is achievable? So therefore, Davis talks about this idea of bell curve. Now it's in the shape of a bell, and he borrows this idea of an average man. Now, who is this average man? Average man is somebody who is at the middle position, middle of everything. And therefore, that's a very safe position to be at. Somebody who would be there in the bell, who would not be at the extremes of the bell. Who would be at the extremes of the bell? Somebody who is a deviant figure. Somebody like a prisoner, somebody who is blind, somebody who is deaf, somebody who has any sort of disability. He also uses the word feeble-mindedness, quote unquote feeble-mindedness. Somebody who is non-standard would be at the extremes of the bell. And somebody who is an average person would be at the middle within the curve of the bell. So the bell curve is like a tyranny, symbol of tyranny. Whoever would not confine into the bell would be seen as a deviant. This is something that he talks about in his essay on the bell curve, constructing normalcy. You can go and have a look at it. And he divides the population. And he talks about how the population is divided into standard and non-standard. And these are the non-standard figures that we are going to study under disability studies. Now he also talks about how there's an ideology of norm. There's an ideology of ability, which is propagated through works of art, through the structures that we are surrounded by. He talks about, he would go on to talk about eugenics as a movement that thought of eliminating the defectives, quote unquote defectives. Now, who are these defectives? These are people who are feeble-minded, deaf, blind, physically disabled. And where is this idea of eugenics coming from? You must have read about Darwinian theory of evolution, of natural selection. There's another writer, Francis Galton, who gives this term eugenics. And he talks about how there is a need to eliminate these people who are defective, because these physical traits could be inherited. And it would lead to an entire race of defectives if they are not eliminated. Something that the Nazi regime followed during the time of Hitler, how the disabled were eliminated, how they were kept into concentration camps. And that was actually something that was followed by what Francis Galton and Darwinian theory of evolution talks about. Then there's another figure, Abraham Graham Bell, and he is actually a very complex figure in a way that he talks about deaf education, but at the same time, he doesn't want deaf and deaf to get married, because it would lead to a race of of more deaf people in this world. So he holds a very complex position when we read him under disability studies. Helen Keller was a student of Abraham Bell, and he was the one who suggested that she should be admitted to a school. And these two figures that you would read, they hold a very complex position under disability studies. And this is where why I'm talking about, all these theoretical frameworks from the West, because it's important why we are reading what we are reading today. Because, when we talk about films and how these films are made, we build them on something like Marx also talk about base and superstructure. So what is the base made of here? When we talk about base here, it's an ableist base. So what are we creating on that? So it's important to read that base first. Now, what are the modern day eugenics techniques that you would see around you? Anyone?
I think across many jurisdictions,
Sorry, I can't hear you.
sorry, across many countries and jurisdictions, a ground for abortion is the abnormalities, they call abnormalities of a fetus. And that is generally read very widely to understand any abnormality such as, say, Down syndrome that you may detect in a fetus.
Definitely.
Yeah, so something like that.
Yeah. So the prenatal testing that we talk about, and there are many more techniques. There are many more modern day things that you would see around you, which talk about this idea of eugenics. The other day, I was reading a billboard where it also talked about IVF babies and how you can produce a perfect baby. The idea of putting the best genes together is something which is a modern day eugenic technique. So when we are talking about disability, we also need to look at these very contemporary things that are happening around us, which are actually in the garb of producing, creating a baby. They're also promoting this idea of body perfection. So what is this idea of body perfection? Who is actually producing the best baby with the best IQ, the best baby with the best genes, is something that we need to carefully look at. Now, when we talk about the norm, we also talk about what our bodies should be like. So this idea of should is something that I want you all to ponder over. Who is deciding this should? And who is deciding this should for the people who are disabled? The able-bodied, are they deciding it for them? And therefore creating the binary of us and them? Who is deciding this notion of progress? It could be different for you, it could be different for me, it could be different for somebody else. This idea of human perfectibility and eliminating what is abnormal, eliminating what is considered as deviant. This idea of quality of life, which I will discuss in the next lecture. So who is deciding this quality of life for us and for the disabled? So one needs to look at these questions of who is writing these stories, who is writing these rules for the disabled population. When a disabilities rights scholar talk about nothing about us without us, this is what they are trying to make you rethink, make us all rethink. So when we are taking a course, when we are taking a workshop on disability studies, I think as a student of disability studies, I would like to request you all to unlearn whatever we have learned so far. There's a lot of unlearning which is required. And I am here as a student. I am here as somebody who is still a student of disability studies, not an expert in the area of disability studies. So it is still a process of unlearning for me. So whatever we have learned in the name of ability, whatever we have learned in the name of progress, whatever we have learned in the name of time, mind it, time for you, time for an able-bodied person, time for a disabled person will hold a different entity, will hold a different meaning. When we talk about the ideas of dependency, when we talk about this idea of independence, what are we talking about? So there has to go, a lot of thinking has to go when we are dealing with disability studies. We need to relook at everything that we have studied so far, whatever we have learned so far. Leonard Davis talks about this middleness and how we aspire to stick to that middleness. And therefore we create this other with respect to that middle. The middleness of life, the middleness of the material world, the middleness of the normal body, the middleness of a sexually gendered, ethnically middle world is created in symbolic form and then reproduced symbolically. This normativity in narrative will by definition create the abnormal, the other, the disabled, the native, the colonized subject, and so on. Now, when we talk about films, how are these films creating something that we talk about a norm? How are these films creating a normate? Or how are they falling into the category of a normative film? So let us look at what is this idea of meta-narrative of disability. David Bolt, and you can read his essays, you can read his book on meta-narrative of disability, and in particular, he also talks about meta-narrative of disability. Before I go on to talk about the meta-narrative concept of disability, let me just give you an instance. Say, for example, you see a blind kid in a metro. What is your first reaction to it? And let's be a little candid about it. It's all right. I think when we are unlearning a lot of things, we need to be, sometimes we need to be candid about it. And it's all right. Anyone?
Ma'am, first we think of his pathetic condition. We think that how he will survive, how he will study, so how much struggle he will face in his life to grow up. So first reaction, most of the cases we feel like this. So basically, sometimes we even relate that if he is not from a good family background, then he will at least have to beg for his livelihood. So these are the first reactions, I think, personally. Most of the people think.
जी. So अभी हमने क्या देखा? What did we do? We created a cloud of story around that person.
Yeah, ma'am. Maybe that he does not think himself in that light. Okay, we think that he suffers, but originally maybe he does not suffer. He is totally adapted to his own world.
So what did we do? We as able-bodied created a story around that person. Anna, you have to say something.
Yes, I wanted to, what I kind of go through is this sort of awkwardness in trying to figure out how I'm going to communicate with that person. I'm a very talkative person. So whenever it kind of that, how is this person going to understand what I am saying if, they're not going to see the expressions on my face, or, something, if it is a blind person or a blind child. And that kind of, there is this constant, every time I talk to them, there is that sort of feeling of what, am I doing everything right? I hope, if I'm talking to other people and they are in the group, then there is that thing at the back of my mind of how are they going to be feeling at this point of time when I am kind of speaking. So, and I always experience this sort of a bit of discomfort in, I don't know if I am able to communicate with this
No,
person.
no, I get it, Anna. I get it. And this is why I wanted you to be a little candid about it. And thank you for doing that. Now, when I talk about meta narratives, we need to look at these first reactions are very important. Uh, these first reactions are called primal scenes. These are primal scenes of interaction between an able-bodied person and a disabled person. And that is the moment which is very crucial. And Rosemary Garland Thompson, in her text on staring, would go on to talk about that in detail, how staring is such an important concept. That a mere stare of, say, for example, 5 seconds or whatever, can be such an enriching experience to talk about when we talk about this interaction between an able-bodied person and a disabled person. So when you look at these concepts, you would see that you are creating a cloud of story around this one person as an able-bodied person. And what we do as able-bodied people, we reduce that disabled person, say for example, that blind person, to that one attribute of being blind, and automatically excluding his or her narrative there. So there is a problem of universality. And this is what is the base that I was talking about. The base on which a film is created, a meta-narrative on which the film gets created about a disabled person. It's very important from which standpoint are we creating a film. Georgina Cleage talks about this very aspect and how there are so many stereotypes that are created around blindness. Georgina Cleage writes about the negative and the reductionist stereotypes related to blindness in her memoir, Sight Unseen. And these are something that, this is actually the cloud of story that I was talking about. Blind means darkness, dependence, destitution, despair. Blind means the beggar in the subway station. Look at him slouching there, unkempt, head bowed, stationary among the rushing crowd. Intermittently, an involuntary twitch jerks his arm upward, making the coin or two in his cup clink. Otherwise, he is silent, apparently speechless. A sign around his neck reads, "I am blind. Please help me." Because blind means needs help and also needs charity. So very clearly, she's talking about how that mere interaction, that very short interaction between an able-bodied and a blind person, give rise to a cloud of story around that blind person. David Bolt would explain it in his words here. The meta-narrative of disability extends this model of social friction by adding that normate reductionism simultaneously initiates a grand expansion into the realms of myths, tropes, stereotypes, and other aspects of the cultural imagination. Personal narratives are displaced in favor of an overarching meta-narrative of disability, largely defined by non-disabled people. And now when we talk about meta-narratives, are we also talking about the metaphors that we create around it? What are the different metaphors that we have around us related to disability? And this is something that Mitchell and Snyder would talk about in their work when they talk about narrative prosthesis and how disability is seen as a metaphor. And when we talk about the characters, when we talk about the disabled characters, are we looking them as signifying of something? Are we looking them as basically a synecdoche of a mere concept? Or are we actually looking at disability as disability in its material reality, in its embodied reality? When we look at a deaf person, are we looking beyond this binary of silence and speech? When we look at blindness, are we looking at the binary of light and darkness, or are we looking beyond that? So are we clouding these characters with metaphors around them? And these metaphors, which are actually very able in nature. Now, what are the different structures that govern the process of creating a film? What are these different aspects of filmmaking? What are these different aspects where ideas are involved, where ideologies are involved in creating a piece of work? Anyone? What are the different aspects of filmmaking? What are the different things that you feel are a part of filmmaking?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm Ananya.
hi, Ananya.
Yeah. So one of the I don't know whether to call it metaphor, but I've always seen that in mainstream Indian films, disability is always linked with the sense of morality in a character, specifically a sense of evil. I can even remember the latest Bahubali series. I mean, I'm not even going back to our classical texts like Mahabharata, where Shakuni limps and there's a sense of evilness. But even in a mainstream film like Bahubali, the evilness of a character is often, perhaps it gets doubled up with the introduction of also a sense of disability in the character. So I'd be interested to know more about why we create a sense of morality in relation to a disabled body. What is the kind
Definitely.
of connection to draw here?
We will talk about it. Can you throw some light on what are the different aspects of filmmaking as somebody who is a viewer and not an expert in film studies or any aspect of filmmaking?
I mean, the first thing that I'm drawn towards when I watch a film is how a story is unfolding, and the story is unfolding in relation to what is actually happening to the characters. It's more often than not. A character is introduced and then something happens, which is also in line with the classical story structure. It's like maybe, and in terms of a disabled character, what I find very interesting is that there is no backstory given, like why and how a person got disabled, but you just show the disability and as if his world changed beyond recognition. We don't get to see the human, we get to see the disability, and a lot of which you
I
rightly
think
pointed out. Yeah,
we'll be talking.
yeah. So
Ananya, when we talk about disability, you rightly pointed out that story is something that is is the first aspect of something you would look at. For bringing that point here, and also when we talk about this backstory, so we'll come back to it in one of my lectures. Why are we looking for these backstories? So
Yes,
that is
yes.
also something that we would be discussing, how we are Am I audible?
Yes, Mansi. Yes.
Yeah, I think there was an internet glitch. I don't know.
Thank you for your observation. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Priyam, are you there?
Yes, Mansi.
Yeah, so what was the last thing that I was saying? Because I think there was some internet issue from my side.
So the last was actually you were answering Ananya's concern.
Hmm.
You asked she asked about the backstory and how the story unfolds.
Just give me a minute. There was some issue on my end.
You were asking different aspects of filmmaking. What are
Yeah.
the different?
So story was something that Ananya mentioned, and let us look at the first sequence of a few films here, and how the cloud of story is created from the very first scene itself. So this is the first scene of the film Khamoshi. And let me just give you a short gist of Khamoshi. Khamoshi talks about the life of Annie, and she talks about her life living with deaf parents and her journey, her conflicts of living in a world which is divided. Her parents are deaf and she is living in a hearing world. So what are her daily conflicts? Okay, and this is something that you would see there as the first scene itself of Khamoshi. So she says, Papa, can you hear me? She is a hearing daughter, and this is something that she is requesting. She is asking her Papa whether he can hear her. And the second scene here says, but what is life without an impossible dream? So the impossible dream here is she wants to listen to her parents talk. She wants to listen her name being called out. Now this is something that is the opening sequence of the film. Let us look at another opening sequence here. This is of the film Black. I'm just sharing, just a second. It's a very short scene from the film Black.
मैं मिशेल मैकनेली, शिमला में बसे एक एंग्लो इंडियन परिवार की बड़ी बेटी। ये कहानी है मेरी और मेरे टीचर की, बची कुची मिट्टी से बनाए गए उन दो इंसानों की जिन्होंने अपनी तकदीर से जंग लड़ी और नामुमकिन को मुमकिन कर दिखाया। मेरी इस कहानी की दुनिया ही कुछ अलग है, जहाँ पहुँचते ही आवाज़ दम तोड़ देती है और रोशनी आंखें मूंद लेती है। ये मेरी दुनिया है, जहाँ कुछ दिखाई नहीं देता, जहाँ कुछ सुनाई नहीं देता। अगर एक ही शब्द में बयां करूं तो मेरी इस कहानी का नाम है ब्लैक। कितनी देर तक आप रह सकते हो इस अंधेरे में?
All right. And there is a third sequence here. So this is the opening scene of film Coaches. And before these were Khamoshi, and the video that you were able to watch was Black. And Koshish has the opening sequence with its opening credits, where there are two people communicating through sign languages. And this is something that was created in the year 1972. And when we are talking about Khamoshi was made in the year 1996, and Black was made in the year 2005. Now, Gulzar something creates, which is, something very exceptional for doing that in the year 1972. He was able to problematize this idea of what is language, what is communication, which, if you see the scenes before this, one from Khamoshi and the other one from Black, they were not able to problematize this concept of what is language. And both the films, juggled between the binaries of abled and disabled. However, Gulzar in the year 1972 is able to create a dialogue of what is the life of people who are deaf. How do they communicate? And how do they live their lives? It's very important when we are reading disability studies. We also have to look at disabilities in very specific ways. When we are talking about deafness, what are the deaf ways of living? When we are talking about blindness, what are the blind ways of living? How do people who are deaf create meaning? How do people who are blind create meaning? And looking them in terms of how they are creating meaning of their lives, not in terms of lack or deficit, but rather as a diverse way of living life. Now, this is something that Emmanuel Laboret talks about, and she is a deaf actress. And she writes here about the deaf ways. And this is something from her autobiography, The Cry of the Gull. And the gull here is something that she is addressed as, because the hearing people see her as a bird who is basically, she has a sound of a bird for them, seagull. So this is where the word comes from. And she writes here, hearing people write books about the deaf. I don't know of any books written by deaf people in France or Europe, for that matter. Some people told me I wouldn't be able to do it, but I wanted to make it happen with all my heart, as much to speak to myself as to deaf and hearing people. I wanted to give the most candid account possible of my life so far. I especially wanted to do it in your native language, the language of my parents, my adopted language. The seagull has grown up and flies with her own wings. I see just as I might hear. My eyes are my ears. I can write as well as sign. My hands speak two languages. I offer my difference to you. My heart is deaf to nothing in this double world. It's very hard for me to leave you. So she talks about how there is a dearth of writing in terms of deaf people writing for themselves, in terms of blind people writing about themselves. And she talks about how the deaf ways would be so different from the non-deaf ways. And this is something that she has written in her autobiography also. So when we talk about the process of filmmaking, and if we are creating a film on a disabled character, about a disabled character, are we looking at these autobiographies? Are we trying to involve people with that disability in the process of filmmaking? Is something that one needs to look at. When Sanjay Leela Bhansali is creating a film like Khamoshi, or when he's creating a film like Black? Is he involving people who are deaf, who are blind in the process of filmmaking? Now, when we talk about deafness, deafness comes across as a subculture to the hegemonic oralist and audist culture, which assumes that speaking is superior to silence, which assumes talking, speech, listening is superior to deafness. And therefore, it takes up and it creates that entire cloud around the people who are deaf. Somebody who is audist, somebody who is oralist would want people to speak, would want people to hear. And if somebody is not doing that, that would create that kind of primal scene of anxiety. Something that Anna talked about when she said that there is some sort of discomfort. Now, to name that discomfort, it's called the primal scene of anxiety. Now, what is this entire when we talk about sign language? There's this whole idea of trying to bring sign language to the status of a proper language here. Indian Sign Language needs to get that status of a proper language here, and it's the irrationality of the hearing of the able-bodied who are not able to see sign language as a language of communication. And Bauman talks about it. He says that a contributing factor to this irrationality, and he calls this as irrationality, may be that hearing people don't actually see sign language, even when they look directly at it. It is not only a foreign language, but a profoundly foreign concept that language would exist outside the full presence of sound. So there's this idea of seeing sound as the most important aspect of living. And similarly, we would see vision as the most important aspect when we would talk about blindness, and why blindness is given that kind of status. Now let us look at the end sequences also here. So this is the last scene of Khamoshi. And there you would see Annie lying on the bed, and the doctors have claimed that she's not going to live anymore. So Salman Khan, Raj, played by Salman Khan, is basically convincing Annie's parents, Flavie and Joseph, to basically speak something. And he literally yells at them. And I could not get the scene here. There was some issue with my laptop. So I have created like a screenshot for you here. And he literally shouts at them so that they could, talk to Annie, and she could wake up here. And the next scene here is he's literally telling them, and he shakes them, just talk to her, kuch bolo usko, she would get up. And the next scene, you would see here that Joseph actually calls out Annie towards the end. And as a disability student, as a disability studies student, you wonder why the scene was necessary here. And as Ananya pointed out, there's this, you look at the story aspect of it. So the start of the film talked about this impossible dream, and which gets accomplished towards the end. So basically, you are trying to bring that order there, that social order there, where people who are deaf are basically talking again. Not as if he's going to talk in a way that a hearing person would talk, but he called out Annie's name. And similar things you would see in Black also. There's this entire inspirational narrative that is attached to Black throughout the film. Throughout the film, you would see she's asked to lip read. Throughout the film, you would see she's asked to basically call out the word water and other words also, and how she's basically tamed by her teacher, Debraj, to speak out. And when she speaks out the first word, water, I think that is the scene that maybe we can look at. Let me just try sharing it here, or maybe we can skip it. How much time do I have? I would skip it, and we can actually go to the last scene of portrait here, where you would see two hands coming together in the form of marriage. So Gulzar bringing back that idea of sign language again. However, the film has its own problems, which we can discuss in detail. But towards the end, there's this, he is establishing that importance of sign language again, which is there in the rolling credits again, that you actually saw in the opening credits too. So why I chose these three films to talk about the start of a film and the end of a film. What do you go back with? It's very important. What do we go back with? As Priyam was mentioning in the last lecture also, the feel-good films. What are these feel-good films? There's always this idea of disability getting cured, or a person who has a disability, he or she, coming out as, as an inspirational figure, as somebody who is overcompensating for the disability. And something, when we look at Black, uh, it's a film that one needs to look at. I think with each frame one can actually study Black and how Black is problematic in its own ways, because nowhere in the film you would see it talks about deaf ontologies or epistemologies. Michelle comes across as a figure who looks more blind than deaf. And this is something which I wish to talk about here in a little detail. What do we mean by ontologies and epistemologies when we talk about these different kind of disabilities? And when we try to look at these ontologies and epistemologies, we are moving towards looking at disability as a diverse way of living, rather than seeing them in a reductionist way of lack or deficit. When we try to look at these different ways of living, we look at disability as diversity. Now, Sandhya Limai, she writes uh, about deaf sociality and how it is so important for deaf people to actually meet other deaf people, to get a feeling of community, to get a feeling of the fact that they are not alone in this. Sandhya Limai interviewed these different girls. One of them is Radha, the other is Hasina, and she writes, hearing impaired persons find that most of their hearing friends are impatient while communicating, often ignoring what the deaf person is trying to get across. In this regard, Hasina comments, I always felt left out when they ignored us. In a similar vein, Radha says, in the end, I turned away from hearing to deaf friends. The former never had time for us. If I did not understand and asked them, they never offered any explanation, as they did not want to disturb their conversation. So, deaf people, it's so important for them to be in a community. And when we talk about deafness, we use deaf with a small d in a lowercase, and we use deaf in an uppercase, addressing two different kind of issues here. Deaf with a lowercase d is something which is a biological condition, where somebody is has a hearing impairment, whereas deaf with a capital D is something when we talk about deafness as a culture at large. Somebody who is deaf would learn sign language. Somebody who is a part of the community, in terms of the deaf community. So that would be the deaf culture there with a capital D there. So when we look at the ontologies and epistemologies here, it's so important to understand what is this idea of understanding and why it is so important for a person who is deaf to understand. We as able-bodied people would take understanding for granted. सामने वाले को हमारी बात समझ आई नहीं आई, we are not bothered. But for a deaf person, it is so important to understand, to communicate that bit. So Michelle Freidner, she talks about why this idea of understanding is important in the deaf world. So she gives you a different way of looking at what is understanding, which able-bodied people have taken for granted. The questions of understanding and not understanding are of critical importance in thinking about deaf people's ontologies, because how they construct worlds and exist within them are based on what they do and do not understand. That is, ontological questions of whether subjects and objects exist cannot be disentangled from questions of what people might understand about those subjects and objects. In the deaf world, understanding is both a need and a desire. And when we look at deafness, it's so important to also understand how a person who is deaf, so the ideas, the expectations that the society has for that person would change when there is this added limitation there, limitation of communication. So what is this idea of womanhood that changes the moment there's a girl who is deaf? So this idea of femininity changes when there is a person, when there is a woman who is deaf. And that one can see in the three characters here also. And Flavie here from the film Khamochi, she was denied any agency in the film because of the fact that she could not speak. And you can go and have a look at the film also. All the talking, all the communication there has been done by Annie or either her father. There's a very small scene that Annie shares with her mother. And there's this scene where, Flavie and Joseph meets Raj's parents who are hearing basically. So there's this scene where Raj's parents are basically getting scared of Flavie and Joseph. It's a very interesting scene how, this scene has been created of this scene of anxiety between the two communities. And there what Flavie does. So otherwise, the entire film shows that Flavie has been denied any sort of agency. In the film Coaches, one would see that Aarti was basically convinced by her mother not to conceive, not to get into a marriage, because two so-called inadequate people would not have a happy marriage. And she also tells her that not to conceive. And there's a scene there where, Aarti is basically confirming from her mother whether, the child is hearing or deaf. So there's this anxiety that's there in Aarti also, whether, and she has internalized that feeling of, that the best way of living is the hearing way of living. So as a deaf person, she also has internalized that. And Jenny Gertz talk about it, and she calls this internalization as dysconscious autism. How these people who are deaf or blind, how they internalize this feeling of, this feeling of inferiority complex. So she uses the word dysconscious autism. So that one can see in Aarti also. Then when we talk about Michelle, how she has been totally denied deaf sociality. And this is something which, when I was reading Black as a text, I felt it as one of the major problems with the film, that Debraj comes across as a teacher who has taught other deaf children also, other deaf students also, but he never introduced them to Michelle. Why was she denied that feeling of friendship with a person with whom she could relate? The entire film, she was left alone. She had this feeling of, being left alone in this world, and she devoted all her life in getting that one degree, which towards the end becomes like an inspiration for, the viewers basically. What if she was given a chance to be with somebody? What if she was given a chance to have that first kiss with another person with whom she could relate? She has her first kiss with her teacher, and therefore creates a whole lot of issues there where, she's again left alone to, deal with her deafness and blindness. And nowhere in the film she is introduced to any other people who is deaf or who is blind or who has any other sort of disability, which actually Gulzar is able to do that. When he talks about Aarti and Hari, he gives them a friend in Narayan. Narayan is their blind friend who is basically helping them in taking care of their child, and he lives with them. And Narayan understands them a lot. And there's a scene where Narayan calls them Hamzaba, and where he calls them Hamzaba, and it is Aarti's mother who calls them Gezuba. So this is very interesting how, Gulzar has used these two words from Durga's mouth, and then Narayan talking about them as somebody who have similar ways of living. Now, it's important to understand who is writing these stories. When I talk about Black, when I talk about Kamoshi, who is writing these stories for the blind characters, who is writing these stories for the deaf characters. Gulzar has created a work which stands out amongst the other two. If we talk about the three films together, Gulzar has created something where he, with the right intentions there, and he talks about that also in one of the interviews. He says that he wanted to show the inclusivity of the society and how deaf people are a part of the society in which we are living. So he has those intentions there. And when he introduces these opening scene and the closing scene there, one could see the intentions there with its own problems. But when we talk about Khamoshi and Black, the film are very, very complex in terms of what they are trying to depict. There's an interesting standpoint in the film, that of being a coda. Now, codas are children of deaf adults, where Ajit and Koshish and Annie and Kamochi acquired that position of, and a lot of scholars have talked about this position of this in-betweenness of in between the deaf and the hearing culture. So one could also see them as bicultural, bilingual, and always at the verge of border crossing. So they have these they are basically living two lives. And Annie is basically finding this very conflicting when she talks about her life between music and silence. Now, the title Khamoshi is also very, I feel that the way it has been used in the film, it falls back into the binary of hearing and silence. So this silence needs to be addressed. What is this silence, and for whom? Who is writing the story of silence? For Annie, it is silence. But what about Flevi and Joseph? What about Aarti and Hari? Their life is not silent there. They are communicating in their own world. They are communicating in their own language. It is actually the problem here is, and I'm very consciously using the word problem here, because the disability is seen as a problem that needs to rectify. So when I use the word problem here, the problem is not with the deaf or the blind. The problem here is with the able-bodied world. Leonard Davis is also a coda, and he has a very, and he writes that in his, there's this autobiography, My Sense of Silence. He writes there, and this is something that he writes about his parents. And this is what I'm reading from his autobiography. Even though they never heard my voice, the sounds of my parents' voices are still in my ears. To most people, the deaf sound strange, guttural, and strangulated. To me, the normal voices of the deaf are soothing, like whale sounds, cooing and arcing under the surface of the deep. I hear sounds effortless and liquid, too high-pitched for human voices, too low for birds. The consonants are not generally sharp enough, the vowels too open. The rising and falling tones of English are strangely absent, replaced by rising and falling that comes from the logic of breadth and the length of word. This is pure poetry of sound. So this is something that he has to say for his parents, very different from what Annie would say about her parents. Now, when we talk about deaf ways, deaf would have their own ways of living. They would design their house according to their own needs. They would have uh, doorbells, they would not have doorbells, they would have door lights there. So their world is the world of eyes. So we need to look at deaf world through deaf eyes. And there's an interesting text which is called Open Your Eyes, to actually understand what the deaf ways are. And there's a scene which was there in Koshish, which I think I would skip. I don't have time to show you that. Maybe towards the end, if I have time, I can show that to you. But we need to look at, when I talk about deaf ontologies and epistemologies, these are the different ways that I'm talking about, that one can look at the diverse way of living. So whether deafness could be called a disability or diversity is something that is debatable. Now, disability as a problem to be fixed is something which, creates puts disability again into that model of medical model. What is the medical model? What does the medical model say? Medical model is something where, you view disability as an individual's problem. An individual would take care of it, whether one can get cured or not. And therefore, pathologizing the disability part of it, whether you can get cured or not, to fit into the larger society. So most of the time it would ask the disabled people to fix themselves. And blindness, the way blindness has been described, represented in the films, it would, create that kind of narrative behind blindness to be cured towards the end, especially when we see women with blindness. Women with blindness are cured towards the end. There are a very handful of films where one would see a disabled woman, a blind woman remains blind towards the end. However, there is a whole trend of films where, the blindness getting cured towards the end. Tanya Tichkasti talks about this idea of blindness as a problem to be fixed. And she talks about why is there this need to rectify it. So she says, those with a condition of eyesight are disturbed when they see blindness because they see that the other does not. Sighted others observe the blind person's gaze and find lack, difference, anomaly, and conspicuous oddness. Eyesight is the condition of normalcy, the expected, communicative, and yet non-obtrusive fact of normal life. Indeed, the condition of eyesight is only brought to awareness in the face of conspicuousness of the blind. Example, odd postures, rocking, tilting, angling, touching, groping, and stigmatized paraphernalia that signifies blindness. So when we look at the cloud of stories behind blindness, this is what we see. And what I'm going back again to what Anna said, that there is that discomfort. What is that discomfort? It's the discomfort that the other cannot see. And the fact that there is some limitation in communication because that other person is not like you. So you create the other around there. You create yourself as a normal, and in relation to you, you are creating a deviant there. Now, when we talk about blindness and femininity, there is a whole lot of films that one can list here, starting from 1938. So Jailer came in 1938. Then there was Patang in 1960. Chirag in 1969, Anurag 1972, Jeel Ke Us Paar 1973, Sunaina and Sangeet in 1980s, Bhrashtachar also in 1980s, Humko Tumse Pyar Hai in 2004, Black 2005, Lafange Parinde came in the later 2000s, Kabil 2012, Margarita with the Straw 2014, Chip of Theseus again in 2012. Now this idea of blindness and femininity has a very common kind of thematic structure when it is represented in the film. You would see a blind girl who's usually shown as orphan, or the father is alcoholic and she's living with a stepmother, and so she is also poverty stricken. So there are multiple level of marginalizations there, and how poverty is such a creates another level of disability. And when we talk about why there is a need to decolonize the disability studies of the West, these are the different parameters that we need to look at. How disability, how blindness is so different in India in comparison to what it is in West. So these are the films that we could use to talk about these issues. Then she would be singing a song, usually, longing for a lover who would basically cure her of her blindness and would take her out from this, cloud of darkness into this sun of light. And then, there is this hero who would come as a heroic character, and who would save her from sexual violence and get her eyesight back. Now, sexual violence is something that one can talk about in detail. There's almost in every film you would see this woman who is blind is getting molested by a person from the same, from the vicinity. And, you would see a male hero coming out and, helping her out. And to the extent that he would give away his own life to, give her this eyesight back. So there's a lot of, common themes that one can observe when we talk about this woman getting cured of her blindness. But there are also films, just a second. Yeah, so there's this, these are the films which would, contest the idea of cure. Now, there's this film called Sunaina. Then there's a film called Sangeet, Margarita with the Straw, Ship of Theseus. How these four films, when they talk about women with disabilities, they are basically contesting this idea of cure, where you would not see women getting cured toward the end. So Nana is the film where for the first time a blind woman in Hindi cinema talked about why she needs to get cured. And who is promoting this idea of cure? And in Sangeet, for the first time, we see that a woman, Sangeeta, played by Madhuri Dixit, she says that she doesn't want this eyesight and she doesn't want to get cured because she's happy the way she is. And Margarita with a Straw, where you would see a woman, in a homosexual relationship, something which is very different from a heterosexual able-bodiedness. And Ship of Theseus is again a film where you would see Alia, a photographer, a blind photographer, who's dealing with somebody who has gained the eyesight back. So what is her life after that? So she feels as if she is lost. So none of the films that we discussed before talked about what would happen after the eyesight is cured. So this is something that you would see in Chip of Theseus. This is like an anthology of 4 stories. So the first one talks about Alia and her life after getting cured of the blindness. Now, when we talk about blindness, we also need to look at blindness and masculinity. And the films that I have listed here are Dosti, Suhag, Katl, Sparsh, Jai Kishan, Aankhein, Andhadhun, Kabil. And there are these films would talk about this common theme of self-pity and how disability interferes with masculinity, because these two terms they do not go together. However, if we see disability and woman, they are almost seen as synonymous. But when it comes to masculinity, it is seen as an antonym. So there's something that I would like to read from here. Having a disability is seen as synonymous, and especially for a man who is blind, for him, having a disability is seen as synonymous with being dependent, childlike, and helpless. An image fundamentally challenging all that is embodied in the ideal male: virility, autonomy, and independence. Thus, the competing cultural expectations of disability on one hand and masculinity on the other invite the question: how do disabled men negotiate with the intersection of these two social categories of experience? Now, these are the questions that I want you to basically look at towards the end of my lecture. What are the different ways in which filmmaking can evolve in, representing the characters, and how the film viewing can change with respect to what we are consuming as consumers. And when we talk about these actors, these directors researching for a film about a disability, what are they researching? So this whole idea of research is something that I wish to, look into, and maybe in the other lectures we can talk about it. And towards the end, there are these two very important questions that I wish to talk about. Who decides what is ability? So are we creating disability cinema or ability cinema? In the garb of disability, are we actually trying to show ability? Is something that I want you all to go home with. And are we all temporarily able-bodied? This is something that I would address in my next lecture when I talk about physical disability and disability that one can acquire due to accident, due to old age, or due to any other incident that can happen in one's life. So are we all on that tangent of temporarily able-bodied? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mansi. It was a very engaging lecture. So now we open the platform for all the questions. You can type it out in the chat box, and we can read it out. Read it out here. And if not, then please use the raise hand option, and then we can use that as a space where you can turn on your mic and ask the question to Mansi. Okay, so our first question is from Mridu Sharma. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Ma'am, I want to ask whether since film is also a product for, it is produced and it is consumed in capitalist terms, it is a product to be marketed in a way that it has to do certain business, right? So it has certain demands of doing well and performing well. And then disability also, it is a medium which has the potential and power of reaching people and creating awareness and of that unlearning that you're saying. So I feel that fine balance is required between making it a product and then conveying in some parts what we are trying to hear, these intellectual things and the concept of norm. Can a film do that? Because otherwise it will be like art cinema or cinema that nobody would be interested in, because there's a certain level of commerciality in films that is also required for it to do well. So can this fine balance be achieved, or would that be another parallel cinema or art cinema where it would be achieved?
I think, Mridu, this is something that has been attempted. Like, I would not say it has been fully achieved, but directors, filmmakers, they're trying to, attempt it. And there's one example that I want to bring forth, and this is something that I will talk about in my next lecture also. One can go back to this film Guru, right? There's this character of Meenu there. Now, when you talk about Meenu, and when you look at a film like Margarita with a Straw, these are the films that have, tried to, look at disability from a very humane way of looking at it. Talking about what are the daily concerns, what are the aspirations, what are the desires. Not that I'm saying that one can fully achieve it. In India, it is still, the disability studies is at a very nascent stage right now. But one can attempt to look at how you are going to, give voice to these characters. It's so important to basically involve the people first. And I think that is the first step of, even attempting it. Like when we talk about Margarita with a Straw, Malini Chip was actually there on the sets. When, the scenes were enacted, when, and Kalki was in, she had, Malini was actually there helping out Kalki. She was not creating those scenes on her own. Malini was helping her out. So it's so important to actually involve people who you are actually talking about in the making of a film. So this idea of research that I was talking about towards the end, so one needs to relook of, what are you researching about? Is it just going to a place, observing something, and that is it? Like you would see when, if you read about Black being, made, and Rani Mukherjee went to these blind schools, and when Khamoshi was being made, these people had gone to certain deaf schools. What was the research that was happening there? So instead of taking an outsider's view of, viewing something from outside and creating a cloud, and this is again, I'm going back to the meta narrative of it. You would create a meta narrative then if you take an outsider's view. So it's important to read those personal narratives and to actually involve yourself there with those people to create something of that intensity. Was I able to answer it, Ridu?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on to the other question that's in the chat box right now.
I can see another hand there. Srijita. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, ma'am. Great session. And
Hi, Srijita.
Hi, ma'am. Ma'am, I just wanted to ask this one question. Actually, when we were talking about metaphors of disability, and somebody said that talking about Shakuni and other characters, that how it is used to show the evilness or evil. As far as I remember, though this is not an example from Hindi cinema or from the East, but from the West, in the popular series Sherlock, it is Dr. Watson who has this certain disability psychosomatic disorder, and he has a limp. But once he meets Sherlock and he gives him the thrill of life back again, he loses that limb. And somehow this whole idea was created through that, his disorder, or that he's limping, that he is using that limb as a medal, that he has served in the war, and he is someone who is a veteran now. And also there is this other Marvel superhero called Matt Murdock, who is a blind superhero. And there too, his disability is used as a power, as I guess sir was also asking this question, somebody in the chat box. So how to view this? Like, then what would be the the perspective, or as you said, the aspect of this? This is what I wanted to ask.
Can you repeat the question, Srijita?
How would we see this? Like, what would be the perspective there? Like, what perspective, through what perspective he is trying to, or those people are trying to build this? Like, how is disability seen in the West? That it appears as a symbol of power, or not as a symbol of the weak or the evil?
Actually, I have not seen both these series.
Okay.
Or even if Priyam has, maybe, she can answer it. I've not seen this one, Sherlock, and the other one, Marvel.
Actually,
Okay.
I have not either. Both have not.
Okay, so basically, yes, they use disability as as a, not as something, a sign of weak or a sign of evil, but rather in Marvel. I hope that you might look into this, and also in response to, or yesterday when I was asking the question that what is the response of disabled community towards such representation, because there too there was this whole discussion that came along, that how when certain movies that are made on the disabled community, but even after making these movies for the disabled community, they do not have the access to watch these movies. Like, how do these people watch it? So in that particular context, I was trying to ask this question.
I think when you are saying somebody is making a film for disabled people, I think that's not right there, because it has its, we are assuming that the audience is able-bodied all the time. So
Yeah.
that's a very big, like a very debatable issue there, because even I have seen a lot of films, and you enter a cinema hall and the film doesn't have any captions, it doesn't have any subtitles. So the other day also I was telling a friend that what if I get a deaf friend with me? How is that friend going to watch the film? So if you are creating a film and if you're talking about concerns of disabilities, you need to create it in, you need to create it in a way that it is accessible for all. And this is actually a part of filmmaking. You need to add subtitles, you need to add captions there, and that should be true for every film that one is making. And I will, maybe I'll watch the series and the film, Srijita, and maybe we can have a chat over it. Because I have not watched these films, so it would not be right to talk about it.
Yeah, ma'am, sure. Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat box. Can one possibly look at the idea of disability from the position of power?
Definitely. Matlab, disability is all about the power relation of, somebody who is an able-bodied person would create the, acquires a dominant position and would create a knowledge system around that. So when we are talking about disability and ability, it is all about power relations. Just like, say, gender, just like race, it is all about a power relation. So definitely it's a power relation, and one needs to look at disability and ability in a relational concept. How would you call somebody abled? Why would you call somebody abled, and why would you call somebody disabled, based on the relation the two would share?
So the next question is, how can one reconcile the privileged position that Malini's narrative endorses with the progressive, inclusive, and positive disability identity politics?
Let me also read it side by side. Yeah.
It's by Himani Vadua.
Yeah. Himani, can you reframe it? Maybe it would help me answering you better. Maybe you can unmute yourself and you can ask in person.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, Himani.
Yeah, so like I've read Chip's narrative and I've seen the movie as well. So the the New York study program, and there's a lot of privilege that is there, which I find is sort of redundant when we look at the entire inclusive position that we are aiming for in disability studies. You are putting up an extraordinary story not everyone has that sort of. I mean, the entire super crib phenomenon, what Michelle and Snyder maybe. So, is it there according to you in that way?
Is it what?
Do you feel that it is positioning an extraordinary privileged position?
Definitely. And one can actually compare, Laila's position and, if we talk about, there's this film that I was watching 2 days back. This was Tanu Ed Manu, and how there's this very small character there of Ayushi, and she comes from uh, a two-tier city, Lucknow, and how, she is controlled by her family. It's a patriarchal family, and all her decisions are being taken by her father and brother. And if one looks at Laila, and if one looks at Ayushi, both these women, and these are the films which are almost made, around the same time, 2014. Tanu Ed's Manu also gets released the same year, and Margarita with the Straw also gets released the same year. So when you are making the films and these, about these women, if you look at these two women and the position of these two women, one can actually see that Laila is she acquires a very, very privileged position. And something when I talk about Guru also, the position of Meenu also comes across as a very privileged position. The fact that Mani Ratnam is making a film about post-independence era, and a woman is able to even voice her concerns about getting married and being financially independent, comes across as a very privileged position, because she has that kind of setup around her. Her grandfather is, he has a printing press, and she comes across a very, very, very progressive woman. So she is able to voice her concerns. Similarly, like Laila, somebody, and I also, if you also read this other character, Afia, represented in Zero. Again, she comes across as a very privileged woman, moving around, maneuvering herself, alone. And that is something that one can also look at, how, she doesn't have even a single assistance that she had taken from somebody in the film. Throughout the film, you would not see her taking any assistance. So what is this position that, Afia is acquiring, or what is this position that Laila is acquiring? Whereas if you look at a woman like Ayushi, and the other woman, if you look at this character of Sunaina in Mukkabaz, she is a woman with speech impairment. How the position of these women change because of their geographical location, because of the economic status, and definitely when these women are placed in the Western, setup, the kind of privilege they would get, even when even voicing a very uh, concern, like whether she wants to be into a relationship, is something, a very big thing that one cannot voice in India. Meenu is able to voice it because of her position, because of the education that she has got. But somebody like Ayushi could not do it, and she is shown as a totally silent character throughout. There's a very small scene in the film. One can go back and look at it, and definitely the position of the disabled character would change with the geographical location, the economic status, the the status of the family, the education of the family. All these factors do affect in the level of disability one would feel.
So we have some more hands raised. Let's go with Ria Chawla. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Great session, Mansi.
Thank you.
I wanted to, I think I got the gist of what we were discussing today. But my primary concern is when you said that while shooting Margarita with the straw, the person she went to the sets and she helped Kalki to channelize the character more vividly or help her work through it. And then you said that in other movies, particularly Black, Rani Mukherjee just went and she researched or she might have done something. what does this mean? And don't you think that you are again limiting the involvement of the person who is disabled? I mean, of course, when a person has when an actor has to depict um, a disabled character, rather a mentally disabled character, or somebody who's physically disabled, they have to go and research, right? They meet people, and that's how they bring, and that's how they bring characters to life. That's a job of an actor, right? So aren't we just limiting again by saying this thing that, you know, the only possible way of being inclusive in cinema is to bring that person to the sets? I mean, maybe I got it. I don't know what's your take on it, or I understood it in that way. So I'm a little confused about the status of the conversation we are having here. Thank you.
So if you, may I know your name? Sorry, Ria,
Ria.
right? Ria, if you look at how I designed my lecture, I have used a lot of personal narratives, right? When I talk about deafness, I talked about this deaf actor there. When I'm talking about blindness, I used a quote from Georgina Cleach talking about what is her personal account of blindness. So what I'm trying to say here is that not that you would bring the same person there, you know, on the set. Malini was there because it was her cousin making that film. So every film would not have the same, you know, they would not have the privilege to do that, obviously not. But the kind of research that one needs to put in. If I am writing about a deaf character, I need to look at deaf autobiographies. I need to look at personal narratives. I need to go and, you know, research about what are the deaf ways. So this is what I'm saying when I'm trying to tell you that, you know, you cannot talk about a community without involving that community there. So you need to include those personal narratives, and only then your film would have those moments of richness there.
So by this we mean that black is not a true representation of a blind person. I mean, is this what we are pointing out, that the research was not done well? I mean, it's again the question is, I know I'm pushing it to the boundaries, but what I'm trying to say is that again, see the point that we are also, you know, we are also able-bodied, and when we do research in disability, the first major question is asked is whether are you disabled, and how you are as an able-bodied, you know, defining and saying that we need to be more inclusive, because we ourselves are on the margins of that community. I mean, in that sense. So this is what I've been baffled with it quite a long. So if you can answer it in any way, it will be helpful.
I think, Ria, when after this workshop, when you go and watch Black again, maybe then we can talk. Because I'm not here to say whether this was a good representation or a bad representation. I'm here to point out how you can read a film about, you know, somebody who is, when you are creating these deaf characters, what are the things that one need to look at? And the points that I was, that if you're talking in particularly about Black, you know, one needs to actually look at people who are deaf, people who are blind, and how they are living their lives. And I think it's very important to, and you know, it's not something that one can get it in a day's time. Let me tell you, Ria, this is not something that one would understand in a day's time. And again, when I was mentioning that we need to look at the base, because the base here is something which is faulty, because, you know, we have created this boundaries, we have created the categories of ability and disability. So when somebody asks us, who are you? So we need to, you know, retrospect, who are we, whether we can actually call ourselves abled or not. And I think, Ria, it's totally okay, because one needs to start thinking in these lines, because, you know, you cannot understand these films, we cannot understand these characters in a day's time. So once we are through with the workshop, maybe then we can at length talk about why there are so many issues with Black.
Right, right. Thank you so much.
So moving on, we also have a hand raised by Anna.
Hi, Mansi.
Anna, I used you throughout. I'm so sorry.
No,
But
no.
it became a reference point because, that was very important, because while we are doing research in disability, at times it's very important to be candid.
Absolutely, absolutely. I
And,
agree with you.
and because we need to understand, we need to go inside actually. What are
Exactly,
these,
yes.
what is this discomfort that surrounds us? And this is something that I will discuss in my next lecture also, when I talk about affective study of disability. So what is it that disability does to you? So yeah, thank you so much for that comment, candid
No,
comment.
in fact, I appreciated the fact that I had a space where I could actually voice this, because this has been going on in my mind for quite a while.
No, that's actually right, because you placed it there. And this is something that I had wanted to talk about when I was talking about meta narratives. कि वो बनता ही कैसे है?
Right. So, like, going on to my question, I hope you watched this movie Aankhein, right? You're the one with Amitabh Bachchan.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
this, right? So, what sort of would that be? Some sort of a disability metaphor or a narrative prosthesis? What sort of a concept do you sort of apply there? How do you see it? How is disability used there? Is it like some sort of subversion? Do you call it that? What?
So there's this concept by Tobin Sivers. He talk about passing. So I think one can very interestingly, talk about how these blind characters are passing as non-blind. It's a very interesting film, and how they are subverting this idea of what a blind can do and what a blind cannot do, because we do create these narratives around blindness of destitution, of dependence, and you see these characters who are passing and doing that robbery there. So definitely you can actually look into this concept of passing. You can actually Google it up.
Could you just repeat the name of the scholar?
Tobin Sivers. He talk about passing.
All right.
And if you need to go back to the historical aspect of passing, you can read this work by Goffman. In his when he talks about stigma, he also uses and he talks about this concept of passing.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We also have Debapriya Sarkar, who's raised the hand. So can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Mansi. It was an amazing session.
Debapriya, I want to appreciate yesterday's question, the one that you had asked.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And I was actually thinking that, somebody is actually thinking on these lines of, aspect of caregiving. And it was actually, later we were discussing, Priyam and I, that, it's so nice to actually, see that somebody is thinking on these lines. So thank you so much for that question yesterday.
Thank you so much. So my question is, in the representation of disability in movies, we see that when it's a person coming from a privileged background, like in Margarita with a Straw, there is this concern about how a disabled body is seen as an asexual being, right? And but in other representation, they cater with how a disabled individual suffers, suffers from even from the lack of basic necessities, like they don't get access to education or things like that. So my question is, can we say that in the politics of identity, sexuality comes as a secondary concern?
Well, definitely for all of us. I think that is true for all of us. I think ये तो बहुत बाद की बात हो जाती है to even voice it. And for Laila, the fact that she is getting, she is exploring the fact that, she could be a bisexual, whether, she is a heterosexual woman. The fact that she is
Yeah,
getting,
exactly.
the space to do that is a very privileged position for a disabled woman, and for a able woman also in India. It's not something that one could do it, come out to her parents easily like that. So I think वो तो हर किसी के लिए it's like that. Sexuality तो बहुत आगे की बात है. अभी तो basics आप and आप sexuality की भी क्या बात कर रहे हैं? Talk about, just basic. How many disabled people do you see around you?
Like, I don't know. It's quite unlikely. We don't see a lot.
Because
Yeah,
there is lack of access.
exactly.
तो access ही नहीं है तो आप लोगों से बात कैसे कर पाओगे? आप लोगों को देख कैसे पाओगे कि आपके आसपास के लोग हैं जो कि disabled हैं? Either they are in their homes, उनको hidden रखा जाता है, उनको बाहर नहीं आने दिया जाता, lack of access or whatever the reason is. तो जब तक आप लोगों से मिलेंगे नहीं, आपका इंटरेक्शन ही नहीं है कि ऐसा भी कोई एग्जिस्ट कर रहा है, तो you would definitely create a crowd around, that person. क्योंकि वो जो एक सडन एनकाउंटर है आपका एक डिफरेंट बॉडी से, वहीं से तो वो सब कुछ बनता है फिर दिमाग. जब तक एक्सेस नहीं है तो वो तो सारी प्रॉब्लम ही वहीं से शुरू हो जाती है.
That's true.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Devapriya.
So moving on to the next person, we also have Garvita Singh, who's raised her hand, and there is also a question in the chat box by her. So I'll read that out as well. Could you explain the meaning of meta narrative in its basics?
मैं तो बहुत बेसिक पे गई गर्विता. I think I couldn't have got to the basics even, इससे ज्यादा basics मैं आपको the example that I had given there, that the moment you see this person who is different from you, so what is that moment of creating a cloud of story around that person? उसके around आप क्या बुनते हैं अपने दिमाग में? So that is a meta narrative. और उसी मेटा नैरेटिव के बेसिस पे बाकी और सारे स्ट्रक्चर्स डिसाइड होते हैं.
Yes. So the way you explained, or the way I interpreted, it is the moment an able-bodied, able-minded individual sees and disabled individual. So this is how I interpreted the meaning of meta-narrative as the explanation of yours. I want to ask, is meta-narrative limited between an interaction, like is it necessarily between an able-bodied and disabled individual? Or either it can be between a disabled individual and another disabled individual. It can be in a community or something. So this is my query. And I thought maybe I would have interpreted it wrong. So I thought.
No, Garvita, you are right. And definitely disability, in the disability community itself, there are hierarchies. And if you go on to read about different communities and the inter-community, say, for example, if you talk about somebody who is deaf, if you talk about somebody who is blind, how would they interact with each other? What is the cloud of narrative build up there? So it's not just an abled and a disabled ka encounter wahan pe. It could be two different bodies of any sort. Right? So meta narrative is not just limiting to abled and disabled. It could be any different bodies coming together.
Okay, I got it now. And I would like to point out that when Ria was talking about the categorization of your explanation of the movies, they used I think twice or thrice that we are all also able-bodied. So it is either Ria and Mansi, and Ria, Mansi, and everybody other present over here. So that is an assumption itself, and that's the most basic thing we're talking about.
Yeah. And I started my lecture on that कि assumptions हमें बंद करनी होगी.
Yeah.
It's all a buildup of assumptions. We assume the other person is able. We assume our viewers are able. Therefore, we create a film like that. We assume everybody around us is an able-bodied person. तो वो उसी से ही सारा जो structures जो create होते हैं वो वहीं से बनते हैं. It's all based on these assumptions to go to the basics of it.
Thank you, Mansi.
Since we have very limited time, so I'll also read a question that was given quite early on in the chat box from Purba. Do you think that the disability movements in India anyhow influenced or brought about a change in the representation of disability in Indian cinema?
पूर्वा, I think ऐसा नहीं हो पाया है. मतलब according to my research and whatever I could figure out, the kind of work that had gone into policy making of the rights and acts for disabled people, that has not impacted the way the filmmaking has been done so far. It's very recent. I think in 2010 onwards, you see a change in narrative. But before that, and you have these acts coming out in the year 95, then 2006, but nothing like that had. I could not observe that the way it could impact the filmmaking process. I think वो filmmaking का अपना एक commercials को लेके they are much more concerned about that, and there's a stylization of it, of creating a film कि वो, I think they could not even map it out there कि there is something else that is happening on the policy making level. तो वो impact मुझे I could not observe it in the films that I have listed down for my research. And even for I was trying to look at if in 1970s I was trying to trace it, that when there was this National Deaf Federation आया, National Blind Federation आया, whether that impacted the filmmaking process. Maybe it would have impacted Gulzar some way, because the kind of film that he made, it showed you that maybe he's trying to create the dialogue there. But later on, when you see the films, you see that diluting, that aspect of creating that space for deaf people, or creating that space for blind people. और deafness के अगर आप respect में बात करें, so there are very less films about deafness, and this is something that is very concerning, that why is there this lack of narrative about deaf people in terms of representation. You would see blind people being represented as blind, or there is also this idea of speech impairment, but जब भी deaf की बात आती है तो वो आपको I think वो 2-3 फिल्म्स ही हैं जिसके बारे में मैंने बात करी अभी. तो पॉलिसी मेकिंग का कुछ ज्यादा आप देख नहीं पाएंगे फिल्म मेकिंग पे उस रिस्पेक्ट में कि maybe they got sensitized, or there was this level of कुछ change इस तरीके से आया. But yeah, I think अभी जो new recently जो films आए हैं जैसे आ है, और say for example तारे ज़मीं पर, so these films created this dialogue about these rare kind of disabilities, but I'm not sure whether that happened after these policies that were made.
So right now we actually have no more time because we've already exceeded the time for the session. But we'll just take the last question from Bhakti Jain. And maybe a lot of the questions are also something that are in underlying in the themes that we have in the coming session. So we can address them as soon as in our next few sessions. So Bhakti, could you unmute yourself?
Hi, I wanted to ask about the representation of the disabled in Andhadhun. How do we, is it a representation of the disabled? Is it not a representation of the disabled? Because throughout we are wondering whether Ayushmann Khurrana's character, is he blind, is he not? How do we take that?
It's a very complex film, and even I'm trying to figure it out, Bhakti. I'm still working on the issues of masculinity and blindness. But I think passing again is something that you can look at. As I was also telling, somebody had asked this question before also about this film called Aankhein, where these characters, blind characters, are passing as non-blind people. So one can look at this concept of passing and masquerading, and how it's up to a disabled person whether to uh, portray themselves as disabled or not. So I think one can read into that and try to look at these characters through that lens.
But
Again,
also,
you can read Tobin Sivers, and he is writing about masquerading and passing, and uh, you can use that kind of lens to analyze this character.
like a disabled character passing off as a non-disabled character is very different from a non-disabled person coming off as a disabled person, right? Because there's a politics of privilege going on here, which is very problematic.
That you can see in a lot of films, like how these non-disabled people would portray themselves as disabled to either gain sympathy, to gain pity, and to come across as somebody who they are not, as a masquerade. So that is observed in a lot of films. What I'm trying to say is, if you are actually looking through this idea of whether he is blind and portraying himself as non-blind, maybe you could look it as a masquerade that he's taking over, and you can have this reading by Tobin Sivers there.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We still have a lot more questions out here asked in the chat box and even hands raised. Mansi, but I mean, because we also have sign language interpreters and we do not have much time at hand. So we'll address these questions in our next few sessions. And if also there are specific discussions or questions you have related or even with regard to disability studies and cinema as a space of discussion and dialogue, I would request that you can probably drop us the email. Mansi, if you can also write your email ID in the chat box.
I'm just doing that.
So you can drop us an email and we can speak to you even in person and have these discussions, and we gain clarity on whatever ideas you want to know with regard to disability studies. So thank you very much. And we look forward to having you all, interacting with you all about disability and also about cinema in particular in the next few sessions. So see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mansi.
Thank you so much, Priyam. Thank you, Anu.